Welcome.
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 Welcome to the unlikely
Seminarian.
Welcome to the Unlikely Seminarian.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Unlikely Seminarian. I am your host, Dan Cook, and thanks again, as always, for taking the time to listen. We're going to start a series in this podcast on Revelation. Not the book of, although that's probably coming at some point, because that's a book that, as I was first coming back into faith, tripped me out. I didn't like the book of Revelation at all. I didn't understand it. It seemed just weird, right? I mean, just really, really strange, and I didn't get it. And then I learned a little bit about apocalyptic literature, and suddenly that book opened itself up to me in all kinds of amazing ways, and it's now, honestly, one of my favorite books of the Bible. So we'll get to that someday. But today we're going to talk about Revelation in the sense of God revealing himself to us. There are two main kinds of revelation. There's what's called general or universal revelation, and then there's what's called specific or special revelation. So we're going to have at least two episodes splitting up between the two of those, and there may be a third one to kind of put a bow on the whole thing. We'll see how it goes, shall we? So let's dig in. Again, we're talking about revelation, and that's important because if God's an infinite being and we are finite beings, then our only way of truly knowing him and his character is through his revelation of himself to us. Is God has to tell us what he's like. We can't truly understand it because we're finite beings, and how as finite beings do you ever get your head around the idea of this infinite being? So it's important to understand not only what God reveals about himself, but maybe even before that, how God goes about revealing himself to us. And as I said, there's two types of that. And today we're going to talk about what's called general or universal revelation. And that kind of revelation is found in multiple places, but chiefly what I want to talk about is the revelation found in nature. Sometimes you hear it referred to as natural theology. I don't know that I want to get that far down the rabbit hole. But I think there is a sense that we get when we examine nature, even in a scientific fashion, that there is something bigger, there is something greater, there is something other going on, or behind it, or responsible for it. And the importance of that is something that we'll kind of wrap this episode up with. But before we get to why it's important, I want to talk about what it is and how we find it. In the Bible, and this gets a little tricky because when you get into specific or special revelation, biblical revelation is part of that. But in the Bible, there are references to God's revealing of himself in nature. Specifically, I want to start with the psalm that's actually C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm, Psalm 19. If you look at the first 6 verses of Psalm 19, they say, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork." Heavens, in this sense, and part of the reason Lewis liked it so much, is he was very much obsessed with this idea of the heavenly realm. The heavens, they're talking about stars and planets and space as they understood, as the psalmist understood them. And that there's some sort of cosmological significance to how those things are ordered. And you see that sort of further defined in the second part of that first verse, "And the sky above proclaims his handiwork." Verse 2 says, "Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and, like a strong man, runs its course with joy. Its rising from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hidden from its heat." So you see discussions of the sun, obviously, and again, that's linked to the heavens. And there's cosmological implications involved there. But the idea is that when the psalmist, and I think Lewis to a great degree, looked at the stars, looked at the sky, looked at the cosmos, and pondered its seeming infinity, it was difficult for the psalmist, and it was obviously difficult for Lewis not to see some power beyond themselves there. Some sort of God, some sort of creator. And that extends from the heavens down to right here on earth. When you start to think about the intricate ways that nature is linked together. Go through the process of photosynthesis, for example, and how plant life converts sun energy into energy it can use and the byproducts from that feed other parts of the ecological system. I mean, it's incredible when you think about the intricacy, the detail, the specificity with which all that has to work together. One could argue that there has to be some form of creator, of intelligence, of design behind all of that. I think you can make a fair argument in that case. Now, there are those, to be fair, there are those who will argue that those things are like they are because they have to be. In order for the system to have come about at all of those dominoes had to fall into place how they did. And that in the randomness of the universe or in the randomness of a multiverse, sooner or later you're going to find that combination and that's going to happen. I can't prove that that particular version of the theory isn't true. I just happen to resonate more with the idea that there's something behind it. Another piece of scripture to take a look at when you're talking about natural or universal or general revelation is found in Romans chapter 1. In verse 20, Paul says, "For his invisible attributes," his obviously being referencing God here, "for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." It's that middle section of verse 20, that the things of God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly perceived. People perceive them ever since the very creation foundation of the world in the things that have been made. So there's revelation in creation itself that we as human beings are able to perceive, presumably because we're created in the image of God. So there's biblical arguments for this. And when you put these ideas together, you end up with something of what's called a cosmological argument, which is simply this: that everything as we know it that exists has a cause to it, right? Anything that has a beginning has a cause. That's the argument. If that's true, we know that the universe itself, or we believe theoretically that the universe itself had a beginning, the Big Bang. The universe as we know it had a beginning, the Big Bang. So if the universe had a beginning, and everything that has a beginning has a cause, then the universe had to have a cause. And when you think of what could possibly cause a universe to come into existence, that sounds a whole awful lot like a God. Now, where the cosmological argument comes up, I don't want to say short, the cosmological argument can be made in favor of a God. The cosmological argument cannot be made in favor of the Judeo-Christian ethic of a God. And that's where general revelation in and of itself somewhat comes up short. Or it doesn't, I don't want to say that. Comes up short is just not a good way of putting it. It's incomplete, I guess is a better way of putting it, in its revelation of God. There is a sense, I believe, and it's part of my journey towards a relationship with God that I began to sense this. I believe there is a sense that there is something bigger than us out there. I think a lot of people, maybe even most, would at least cop to that, would at least admit that there's a sense of something beyond ourselves out there. But that's where a lot of people want to stop, because they don't want to get sucked into dogma and doctrine of specific religions. They don't find that useful. They don't find that helpful. And I understand that. I do. I personally go beyond it. I know many of you listening go beyond it. But I have a lot of understanding and grace for those folks that want to stop there. And that's what actually necessitates the notion of special revelation. That in order to truly understand the nature of God's being, to understand the very foundation of his existence, we have to go beyond just what's in the natural world. But it's important to identify that that natural stuff is out there. Because I think, A, it provides a foundation from which we have common ground with those who don't believe as we do. Whether people believe in other religions, or whether people don't believe in any religion at all, that general sense that there is something beyond us, that general sense that all of this came together in a way that's seemingly not random, is common ground, is places where we can agree. And from there, we can build perhaps slightly greater consensus. And speaking of other religions, I think the idea of general revelation also explains the existence of all of the religions on the planet. That there is this divine essence to the natural world such that humanity has sought to explain it throughout the history of time. That's why there are exponentially more people on this planet that believe in some form of divinity than those who are truly atheistic. Which doesn't mean I want to write off my atheist friends. I know plenty of atheist folks. They're wonderful people, and I love them dearly. But there is a sense, because of this general idea of God's existence, of the existence of some sort of divine, something beyond us, that helps explain why there's so many different religions out there. Human beings have sought throughout the history of time to understand what this thing that we naturally sense actually is. It also serves to explain sort of a baseline for why morality is so consistent throughout the world. That there is this basic thing woven into the very nature of creation that says that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Now, there's all kinds of shades of gray in between those two, so don't get me wrong in that regard. I don't want to oversimplify it. But there are certain very basic foundational things that people of all kinds of different backgrounds and colors and creeds and religions can agree upon that tell us that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And that essence of divinity that we find in the very foundation of creation, I think, helps to explain that. So that's general or universal revelation. In the next episode, we're going to talk about specific or special revelation, how that relates to general revelation, and why it's so important that we have the two of them. That's next time. I hope you'll join me. This is Dan Cook, and you've been listening to The Unlikely Seminarian.